Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. So today we've got two big topics I want to discuss. The first is Joe Biden's CNN town hall he did last night, and the second is on the topic of cancel culture. Conservatives love talking about cancel culture, and there's been a ton of news stories that have dealt with the topic. So I'm going to do a thematic analysis on this subject, and particularly as it pertains to a couple of big news stories that have been happening right now. But first, the Joe Biden CNN town hall. Once again, Biden showed off that he's, not in 100% shape, that there may be some significant mental decline going on, even though he was able to trudge through the answers and not fall over or show that he's can't do the job that he needs to. Or rather, the job of just going on TV for a little bit and delivering coherent answers. For the most part, he succeeded, but there were clearly some big gaffes, and, his way of speaking, any other president, we would have been like, what's going on with Joe Biden? But with Joe Biden, he's automatically at they give him a handicap in the media, and they praise him no matter if he gets through the answers. And anytime he gets through an answer, they go wild. The media gave Biden some of its legendary room service journalism last night when he made one of his biggest gaffes. He said that there was no vaccine before he took office. There was clearly a vaccine before he took office. When this was, spread all over Twitter, Glenn Kessler, who's the main fact checker at Washington Post, said this is just a verbal gaffe, a stumble that we shouldn't worry about. It's just a typical Biden saying, and I'm not going to fact check this because, we knew what he was saying. And people are like, are you sure about that? And it's like, is that the standard? And then he's like, yes, he has a stuttering problem. And this is clearly a result of the stuttering problem. And it's obviously not, because the administration continues to say that there was no vaccine program. There was no rollout plan. There was nothing before they entered office, that apparently no one was getting the vaccine. And then they came in office, and now millions and millions of people are suddenly getting the vaccine, and there was nothing in place. And Kamala Harris said this in an Axios interview this week, that she was saying, there was nothing before us. And then the reporter gently is like, well, Dr. Fauci said that there was something. And, of course, Dr. Fauci has said that there was a program in place. When that was released, that was by Axios. Axios deleted that tweet showing them fact-checking the administration, and instead they just showed Kamala's claim, no fact check at all. And once again, Kessler's comment is showing that they will go to the ends of the earth to, play favor for the Biden administration, that they will do anything possible to spread their narrative, and they're not going to question it. So if they're going to say that there was no vaccine before, they'll be like, oh, interesting. I think that may be the case, even though it's clearly not the case. They're not going to fact check it. And anytime they fact check these claims, they're not going to go to the extent that it was with Trump. And Trump, they would fact check anything Trump would say. Trump would make a joke and they would fact check it. Or Trump, we're going to build the wall. And they would say false. Or, Trump would make, call Joe Biden Sleepy Joe Biden. And it's like, fact check, Joe Biden is not Sleepy Joe Biden. So they would go into this literal autistic mode when it came to any Trump claim. There was no degree of, letting Trump have space to make jokes. They would fact check his jokes. But anytime Biden says something that the rest of the administration is saying, such as there was no vaccine program before they entered in, that apparently is just all chalked up to his stuttering problem. So the room service journalism continues, and I hope they're getting tips. Busboys get tips when they deliver room service, but apparently journalists aren't. And I don't even think they're getting any interesting scoops besides finding out what Tony Blinken's favorite pair of socks are. So we'll have to see what goes on with that. But Biden was, besides making gaffes, these also deal with gaffes. Biden had some interesting things to say about race in America, or racial topics in general. So he made some pretty hilarious gaffes when he was talking about blacks. He said that blacks and Hispanics don't know how to get online, that minorities don't know how to get online. He said that to explain why they're not getting vaccinated, which is a current obsession right now about why blacks aren't getting vaccinated. And they'll bring up the Tuskegee experiments and other things that clearly I don't know if the average black person necessarily is fully aware of, but they're just not getting these vaccines. And New York City released some goofy rap video with one of the Run DMC members to like convince blacks to go get vaccines, which it's apparently not working, but we'll have to see. But anyway, he's made this in the context that apparently they don't have the internet, even though most of them have smartphones and probably can look up how to get a vaccinated. But apparently they don't know how to get online. It's a big mystery to them. I'm wondering if Glenn Kessler or PolitiFact or anybody else is going to fact check the claim that minorities can't get online. We'll have to wait on that. I don't think they will. One of the second funny claims is he was talking in a context about changing values and the police departments and how they need to get rid of their bias. And he was talking about how, we would have never thought that every second or third ad would feature a biracial couple. And he's like, almost, you're not quite clear when he makes this comment if that's like a criticism or a praise, but he later goes on to praise that this is a wonderful thing that every advertising company is putting biracial couples in its ads. And it is true. If you ever watch TV, pretty much every couple is either biracial or gay. I mean, there is no, like, if it's a straight white couple, you're like, what is going on here? If you looked at our advertising, you would think that a straight white couple is probably only like 5% of couples in America, because you rarely see them. And anytime you do, it's in the context of like the wife bullying her beta husband, who's like an idiot, who's like, I didn't know I couldn't put a fork in the outlet. And it's like, of course you didn't, honey. And it's like him scolding him for being an idiot, and he's like a loser. He's like fat, doesn't know how to do anything. So like any straight white couple isn't portrayed positively, but you'll see these wonderful images of interracial couples and of course gay couples who are loving families, that both partners are smart and intelligent and know what brands to buy. But the straight white couples, the husband's just an idiot. He's just a loser. I can't believe the wife is with him. And that's always the message conveyed in these advertisements. But so he's commenting on this, and it's a very strange comment for a president to make. It's true. That's true. And he was like praising it because you have to praise it. But oftentimes many people aren't going to point this out. And if you ever talk to old boomers or anybody else, they notice this. They're like, anytime I'm watching TV, this is all I see and all I'm inundated. And they're, a little turned off by it. I don't know necessarily if the propaganda is working on the general population, on younger people, but it is something a lot of people notice. And it's not necessarily something you're supposed to notice only if you're praising it. And of course, Biden, while, clearly showing some discomfort in the way he phrased it and the way he said it, he eventually went on to praise it because he knows what he needs to do. And this is another time that he had to correct himself, is that he was talking about crime levels, and it's also about police. And he was saying that instead of police violence, the real concern among blacks is black on black crime, and the same with the Hispanics, is Hispanic crime. And he immediately is like, oh shit, I'm not supposed to say that. He's like, well, we're switching to training, and actually the real problem is police violence, and we need to work on this issue. And this is very different for the biracial couple. I mean, the initial way he said it was a way of discomfort, but he then went on to say, this shows how great our new society is. The young generation, they're so open, and advertising reflects their desires and their attitudes, which I don't necessarily think it is. I think the these marketing companies are staffed by huge libs, and they're pushing this message no matter what, and they want to get woke points for showing a biracial couple. It's not necessarily that the people are like, I'm not going to buy this car unless I'm seeing a biracial couple drive it. I don't think anyone's saying that. And it's just what marketers put in there. But with this, the police are the black on black crime versus police shootings. He knew that was a big no-no. But he was almost went back to, he thought it was 1994. And, when there were black leaders openly talking about the dangers of black on black crime, and they were saying that, like, we want more police to end black on black crime. Like, other blacks are killing other blacks. This is what's devastating our community. We want you to take care of these problems in our community, and that can only be done through tougher law enforcement. But that's no longer the message, nearly 30 years later. It's that the real problem is police violence and over policing, and this is what causes all the violence in the communities. And once you have nicer police that never use their batons and never use pepper spray and only use words to calm down everyone, then we'll have no crime at all. Black on black crime will disappear. It's actually not even a problem. It's really white on black crime. You have to worry about all these fantasy white supremacists coming out to kill minorities, which goes into another point about Biden. But before I finish up, this shows that was like a funnier moment that, Biden deep down probably has some conservative attitudes. And clearly, he spent, most of his political career on, being a strong law and order candidate. Throughout the 80s and 90s, he was pushing for this legislation. But now he has to do a complete 180 and abandon all that in order to appease the far left. And it was an open slip up. It was an open admission of truth that the real problem is black on black crime in these communities, far more than police violence. And if you look at the death totals, it's no comparison there. But you can't admit that anymore, and that's why he had to do an immediate correction with it. And it was very funny. He's like abruptly changed subject when it occurred. But going on is, there was some professor from, I think it was the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, who asked Biden a question about the threat white supremacists pose to our democracy. And of course, Biden agreed and said that white supremacists are the number one threat, and they have long been the number one threat, because he brought up, I got into my office to fight back against the Klan. And, he became a senator in 1972. The Klan was, already, defeated at the time. The Klan had been infested with federal informants and neutralized by the late 60s. It wasn't doing anything, especially not in Delaware. I mean, Delaware, I don't even think in the 50s and 60s really had much of a Klan presence. They were already long gone. There was far bigger problems. I mean, crime was skyrocketing. There was economic issues. There was far bigger problems than the Klan. I mean, that had already been put in the past, by at least 5 years when he got into office. But that's what he said. He's like, I got into office to fight back against the huge threat that the Ku Klux Klan posed to America, and they still pose to America. And this is our number one terror threat, and he's going to devote all the resources of the federal government to tackling this issue. And, once again, it does show these priorities that, they're going to let all these criminals go off. They're not going to address black on black crime. They're not going to address the skyrocketing murder rates, but they are going to focus on this fantasy threat of white supremacy. When we have all these other issues, we have serious violence going on in most major cities, but they're not going to tackle that, because the only way they can tackle it is if they have white culprits behind the violence. But of course they don't have white culprits behind the violence going on in Philadelphia or Baltimore or Detroit, St. Louis, New York City, where they're seeing a rising murder rate. That's not who is at fault here. So instead, they're just going to ignore it, pretend that it's the police officer's fault, or it's a white supremacist's fault, or it's white supremacists putting on black makeup and killing people randomly. It's not normal inner city violence that's occurring. So they're just going to put all the blame on white supremacists. So at the time that we have, rising murder rate, the number one threat is white supremacists, because of the Capitol protests, where a vast majority of people just walked into the Capitol without permission and took pictures, and somehow this threatened to topple our democracy. So that's the stuff about race. And there was another thing that really outraged conservatives, is when he was talking about China and the Uyghurs and their policy, and they were looking for him to denounce it, but he refused to denounce it. He said that there's different cultural norms between us and China, which is true. And, he gave a mealy-mouthed answer about it. He didn't directly condemn it. He said that, China wants a united state, and they're using these measures to achieve that, which is, true. But they're so angry about this. Like, conservatives are so angry that he won't condemn the Uyghur, what China's doing to the Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities. And you just have to say, it's like, well, okay. I mean, this is not the thing to get mad over. I really do think that when they get, it is ridiculous that, Biden is saying this. And it does show that he wants cozier relationship with China. And of course, his family has business dealings there, and he doesn't want to alienate them. And he's not going to talk tough to China like he would in the case of Russia, or, he's probably talked tougher to Viktor Orban in Hungary. more than he was Xi Jinping in China. And that's just the fact of the matter. But I think conservatives getting really mad about this. It's a total distraction. Worrying this much about China, it's mainly good to take away from all the venom directed towards Russia, which it's not really working, because many of these conservatives who also want to denounce China are just as histrionic about Russia and supporting Navalny and, believing that these protests by a few college students is somehow going to topple Putin, and this is what threatens Putin. Many of the conservatives share that same attitude. And that's one of the main benefits of, focusing on China, is that it would take away a lot of the energy directed towards Russia, which is not working. And at the same time, now this is not saying that China is not a threat. I mean, China is a problem. It is a threat. It's not our friend. We should reduce our business dealings with it. We should bring back our manufacturing from China. I don't really like some of these right-wingers who think that China is our salvation. That's not true. But at the same time, getting this worked up about China, it's a distraction for the real issues that we have. The globalist empire is our real problem, not China. Our own leaders who are restricting free speech is our problem, not China restricting free speech in Hong Kong. Yeah, it's like I always hate this when they complain about Hong Kong, like, oh, they're kicking off Hong Kong activists from their bank accounts. It's like, this thing happens in America. And Biden is actually trying to repeal the rule that would disallow that from happening here. Disallowing debanking over your political beliefs. Biden's trying to eliminate that rule that the Trump administration put in. That's a far bigger problem than what we have in China. I think we need to focus on our own problems. And anytime we're bringing up the Uyghurs and Hong Kong, it's just a way of signaling. And there's no real solution to it because people don't want a war. And they don't want tariffs on China because all these conservatives are like, oh, we can't put tariffs on China. That hurts our economy. So they have no real solution to this. And it's just a way of complaining and distracting from our real domestic problems and then pretending that China is the real fault of it. And there's even people who, I'll get into this a bit, who will blame China for our cancel culture. And it's like, no, it's not China. It's our own elites. So that's enough about Biden's town hall. Now moving on, as I previously alluded to, cancel culture and all these news stories that are building up to this huge issue that conservatives are greatly worried about. So one of the first places that cancel culture is threatening is one of America's preeminent institutions, the New York Times. They've had at least 3 stories in, the last week or so that have dealt with this topic. The first big one is Don McNeil, who is their star COVID reporter. He's, I think, 67 years old, been at the paper for over 40 years. And he was fired, pushed out, rather. I think he may have said that he resigned, but he was resigned under pressure. And it's in the paper sticking with resignation. But anyway, he was pushed out over these claims that were made by wealthy white students who went on a trip, this New York Times sponsored trip, where they would take deserving students. Most of them had to shell thousands of dollars to go on this trip. And they'd go around the world and learn about journalism from a star New York Times reporter. Well, he got to this trip in 2019, and he's an ornery old man, and these kids were asking him stupid questions about like white privilege and racism. And, the problems they deal with racism at their elite prep schools like Exeter and Andover, where they're clearly not dealing with real issues. And they kept pestering him with these answers. And he would have a heated boomer moment where he's like, white privilege isn't real. Racism is over. Get over it. There's no institutional problems. And it's like some 17-year-old kid is like, oh, well, how can you say that? And he's like, I don't give a shit. I'm just here on this trip. So it sounded like this is just an old man who wanted a trip to Peru, a free trip to Peru, and didn't really know how to talk to the kids. And at some point, one of the students brought up said that they heard a fellow student say the N-word, and then he repeated the question in reference to it, not actually directing it at anybody. And this was the offense that did him in, that you can't. And New York Times said that if you're white, you cannot say the N-word in any context, even in reference to something like if you're reading, Huckleberry Finn. you're just going to have to skip over the N word. You can't look at it because, you don't want to be a racist by looking at that word. So he had this problem. He was pushed out, and this guy was like all the time on MSNBC. As I said, he had been there for 40 years. And he was the main person on COVID reporting, and liberals loved him for that. But he was pushed out over these prep school kids getting mad that he wasn't woke enough on their school trip. And he was just like a typical cranky old man. And they pushed him out, and everyone's now upset that, the union didn't help him out. He was a longtime union organizer and activist with the New York Times Writer Union. They didn't help him out at all, and they said that this is actually, a warranted firing. Didn't care at all about his past record of service or his long tenure. They said any accusation of racism, we're no longer to defend you. And it cuts into, some of the people, national populist types who think that unions are great and they'll defend people from wokeness. The New York Times Union didn't do anything to help out one of their main organizers due to these spurious accusations of racism. They let him go, and they praised the paper's management for doing so. This same union had pushed out the past opinion editor, James Bennett, who got a lot of heat for publishing Tom Cotton's call to bring in the military to suppress the riots over the summer. The union pushed for him to get out, and they were demanding serious answers because it was really threatening. This op-ed was threatening the safety of many of its staffers, which clearly it did not threaten anyone's safety, but they still made this claim anyway. So that's the first thing that has happened with New York Times, Don McNeil's departure. The second thing is there was a big story that had been long anticipated. There was a hit piece on Slate Star Codex, and you may ask, what is Slate Star Codex? Well, it's a old blog. It was since taken offline over the threat of doxing. It was run by one Scott Alexander, whose real name is Scott Alexander Siskin, which was revealed in this article. And it was a rationalist blog that mainly talked about nerdy stuff that a lot of Silicon Valley people are into. It occasionally talked about naughty subjects such as human biodiversity and race and IQ, and linked to people like Mencius Moldbug and Nick Land, which you're not supposed to do. And this whole article was trying to say that Slate Star Codex is Silicon Valley safe space where they're able to engage in dangerous ideas, and it connected people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk to Slate Star Codex and all these neo-reactionary types, and saying that this is something to be concerned with. Well, last summer that this, when this article was first emerged, apparently it took 7 or 8 months to write. How why it took so long, I don't know. But it initially came out as that Scott Alexander on his blog before shutting it down said, I'm having to shut down this blog because the New York Times is threatening to dox me. And, doxing is not really good. But the guy hasn't really said anything that, to worry about. But this guy went into full meltdown. He was like saying, my life is in jeopardy and my safety, I can't put my safety at risk. And I live in a communal housing with 10 other people and there's some young children there. And you have to be like, wait a minute. You live in a communal housing with 10 other people and you're like a successful psychiatrist? And that was another reason he said that he can't reveal himself, because that would impact his, his private, his day job, which is a psychiatrist. And for some reason, he lives in a communal housing with 10 other people. I guess it's a polycule. I'm not quite sure what the situation is. It's something weird going on. So he went through this whole meltdown, and all of conservative media and a lot of rationalist types like Steven Pinker, Harvard professor, who was friends with Jeffrey Epstein. Some of these other people, a lot of other people, intellectual dark web, they all treated this as the most heinous crime ever to threaten to dox Scott Alexander. And this is going to lead to serious danger. And there's never been anyone who's been threatened with the dox before by the New York Times, which, there's been several other people who have been threatened with such measures. And some of these people have said actually controversial things that could, jeopardize their livelihood, actually bring about threats and violence toward them. I don't know if Antifa is ever going to go after some nerdy rationalist who mainly talks about science subjects. Maybe. I don't think so, though, but this guy seriously said that, and he was able to elicit a lot of support and sympathy due to this claim. And he's once again eliciting a lot of support and sympathy, in the wake of the publication of this article last week. And a lot of people are just like, this is an outrage that someone would do this. And many of the people who are complaining about Scott Alexander's doxing have ignored countless other people's doxing and cancellations and greater threats to them. I mean, it is good that they are pushing back against journalists and, making them, try to follow some degree of standards. But at the same time, it's like, it's not the biggest of deal. And the guy didn't even do a very good job of hiding his identity. I think his name had been revealed before, and his real name, I mean, he uses his first and middle name, and he always says he's a psychiatrist, and I'm sure it was, and he lives in the Bay Area. I don't think it was that hard to find who he was. Yes, it's a problem for it to be in the New York Times, but for most people, it's the way of the life, and you shouldn't delete your blog over it. But so that's another case of the cancel culture that's going on in the New York Times. And the third case was, of course, Taylor Lorenz, who's the TikTok reporter. She recently got into hot water because she claimed Mark Andreessen, who is a entrepreneur, I think he would technically be counted as a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. He was on Clubhouse, which Clubhouse is this new elite format that pretty much every person who's defending Scott Alexander is obsessed with Clubhouse, like intellectual dark web, some conning types. A lot of these centrists and moderate liberals are on Clubhouse, and they love it because they're able to share messages and they're deleted, and they're not protects them from journalist intrusion, I guess. Well, she claimed that Mark Andreessen said the word retarded on Clubhouse. It turned out not to be. And then there was this wave of backlash against her. And anytime there's a wave of backlash against her, journalists rally around and support her work. And pretty much all of her work is done to doxing people and attacking people for wrong things they say on the internet. I think she's even tracked down like teenagers who said wrong things. And now they're like some gaming personality, and they said some like offensive things when they're 12 years old on like Xbox Live, and she would track it down and demand apologies. She went after Pamela Geller's kids, who were rising, I think, Instagram stars, and she went after them and got them canceled due to the fact that their mother is Pamela Geller, who, if you may not know Pamela Geller, she's a famous anti-Islam activist. She's a little unhinged, but, that doesn't mean that her kids should be canceled due to their relationship with their mother. And she forced them to denounce her as well. So she's like a horrible journalist, and this is pretty much her stock and trade, is just to go after and dox people and to ruin their lives. And there was like plenty of backlash against it. She gave a lame apology, but she kept her job at the New York Times despite spreading a lie about a prominent person, and there was no consequences. And she's done this similar things before. So the big topic is that a lot of people are talking about is like, what does this mean about the New York Times? Because the New York Times personnel decisions keep making news stories. If anyone leaves or gets fired, it becomes national news. There was some editor who was fired over fangirling over Biden, saying it sends chills. She gets goosebumps looking at Biden and the presidency. She's just so excited. And apparently they fired her because, that's showing a complete lack of objectivity, which none of these reporters have any objectivity. It's a joke. There's probably other personnel matters going on with this editor, but, this is the last straw. But that became a national news story. As previously mentioned, the drama over the Tom Cotton op-ed over the summer with, and forcing out the opinion editor, James Bennett, that was a major national news story. So anytime these personnel decisions happen in the New York Times, they become national news. The obvious reason for this is that the New York Times is it's the standard bearer of American journalism. It's the paper of record. We've always looked to the New York Times as the standard of journalism. We've always expected it to be relatively objective. I mean, of course, it's always leaned liberal, but not to an extent that you would see on MSNBC or something like the New Republic. You've always opened up the paper and reading an average story, you would mostly just see the facts. Of course, they would leave out certain facts that maybe counter their narrative, or there'd be certain stories they wouldn't focus on because, it would counter what liberals want to believe. So, yeah, there's been examples, but you've always been, wanted to go open the New York Times and it's been free of the kind of radicalism that would go on at Huffington Post or Vice News or any of those other type of outlets. But now you're just seeing it take over the New York Times. And it is an interesting, development that this paper that you would have once thought that you could open up its pages, see some grizzled, old, cranky reporter like Don McNeil, who, I guess they're center left, they lean left, but they're not going to, write about white privilege or put proper gender pronouns in there. They would just give you the facts relatively, and it'd be an experience that you could, take away from. But if you ever read a New York Times article now, it's about as bad as like CNN chyrons. The CNN chyrons, whenever they'd have about Trump, they'd have fact check. It's like, Trump says America's great, forgets that this is a white supremacist country. There'd be stuff like that in there. And you'll see that now in the New York Times. Whenever they cover Trump, they'd be like, terrorist enabler Donald Trump tells his supporter complete lies. The way that they would write this is like totally over the top, just like extremely anti-Trump, extremely liberal. And they did this because they were attuned to social media pressures. They would see that they're getting raked over the coals by the left on Twitter and be like, we've got to edit this. We've got to edit this article. And there's even a Twitter account that, tracks editing changes in the New York Times. And anytime you see this, that there's like an objective article that just lays out the facts, they'll edit it to be far more liberal. And there'll be something, say, about the riots. They'll call, Black Lives Matter demonstrations riots. Then they'll change it to mostly peaceful protests. There were maybe some buildings damaged, but we're not going to use that as the focus. They would take that out of like the opening paragraph. And so there is like this effect that's going on at the Times, which, that this media institution is becoming, it's dropping the pretense and it's becoming brazen in its leftism and in the message it's sending to America. Now, there's been a lot of theories of like what's going on here. What's this say? What's the conflict going on in the New York Times? And there was an interesting Free Beacon piece, Washington Free Beacon, which is of course a neoconservative outlet that started by money funding from Paul Singer and was founded by Bill Kristol's son-in-law, Matthew Continetti. And it occasionally has some good articles, and some of the people there are, they'll write stuff about critical race theory and racial indoctrination in schools. That's pretty good. And there's some other stuff that they get some good scoops on Democrats and some of their crazy plans. So I was reading this article. It was written by one Aaron Sibarium. I guess it's Sibarium. It could be Sibarium. I don't know. We'll say Sibarium. He wrote about how the union wasn't standing up for Donald McNeil and what this means. And his argument is that the conflict of the New York Times is between these working class or middle class, older reporters who just want to focus on the objective facts versus these wealthy prep school kids who have all this privilege and they're super woke and they're trying to destroy, this prestige institution. And really what they were saying, first off, Don McNeil, went to an elite school too. He went to Berkeley. And the other example that they always say is who's a victim of New York Times cancel culture is Barry Weiss, who's this horrible, centrist, neoconservative writer who's a total idiot. Occasionally she like pushes back against the far left in the dumbest way possible. And then she receives mild criticism and then she says she's getting canceled. And eventually she was forced out of the New York Times, possibly for being annoying and not writing anything that's particularly good. But she was forced out and she became a cause célèbre for the conservatives as like, this is a sign the New York Times has fallen, is that they got rid of this brave woman, Barry Weiss. And every time that something like this happens, that she writes a stupid article and leftists criticize her, once again, she's like a brave speaker of truth. But she also went to an elite school. She went to Columbia. And her parents are loaded, so there's not working class there either. And some of the people that they accuse of being on the woke side, I mean, it really is they're imagining Taylor Renz, Taylor Renz went to a Swiss boarding school that costs nearly $90,000 a year to attend. That's who they're really thinking of. I mean, but the other leaders of it, it's like Nicole Hannah-Jones went to Notre Dame, didn't really grow up wealthy. She's black though, so they don't want to imagine her because they just want to imagine as wealthy white kids who went to prep schools. They don't want to imagine that it could be non-whites involved in these shenanigans. And it actually does involve a lot of their non-white writers. I think Jamel Bowie, who was a military brat, I mean, he wouldn't necessarily someone say that he's upper class background. He's also involved in this stuff. I mean, Charles Blow, another black columnist, they're all supporting the woke crowd. I mean, it is largely non-white driven, but it is like their younger staffers who, not their older staffers. And you have to look at this like conflict. It is like a conflict between these old school liberals. A lot of them happen to be Jewish. I mean, Barry Weiss is, Don McNeil isn't. I think James Bennett is. The former opinion editor, who really, they're center left, they're liberals, and they also think that Donald Trump is an evil white supremacist, and the Capitol protests were an insurrection against our government and deserve the full brunt of the thrust. But they, at the same time, they want to give air to the conservatives they like. They like David Brooks. They respect Ross Douthat, who's another New York Times columnist, and they like Bill Kristol and these types, and they don't necessarily, and they will tolerate, I guess, some libertarian opinions and etc. They do want to pretend that there's this liberal consensus, and they really don't like the 1619 Project that destroys the liberal consensus, that imagines the founding fathers as not as these proto-liberals, but as evil white supremacists. They don't really like that. They do have this narrative that they've built over time that they learned in school that imagines that America has been moving on this path to greatness and progress. And, there may have been some racism at the beginning, but now it's all good. And, we should accept some different opinions, not Trump supporters, of course, but some conservatives we can accept. So this is their mentality that, this is primarily the old elite that was dominated by Ellis Islanders who had first come over. But now it's being replaced by a new elite that is even less white. A lot of Asians, a lot of Indians involved, more blacks who are having a bigger say. A lot of white Gentile women are also involved for once again, the awful phenomenon is a part of this. This is the woke crowd that's involved in this. They don't want any conservative. Bill Kristol is too much for them. They want an explicitly leftist line. They don't even want to maintain the pretense of objectivity. And this is the conflict that's going on, not just in the New York Times, but in universities and every elite institution. And the New York Times is just a microcosm of the elite, of the conflict going on among our elites between this old elite represented by James Bennett, by Don McNeil, that, shows if you just work hard and you believe in America, and yes, they lean left and they, support gun control and they think Donald Trump's a racist. But they, at the same time, want to maintain this pretense that this is like the consensus they have. They maintain the old narratives about American history. They also believe that this country is a good place. And yeah, they'll accept white privilege, but, racism isn't necessarily, we're not necessarily a racist society now. And this is getting replaced by more hysteric, more aggressive left that's more non-white. But it does have plenty of white allies, and they are getting, I would say that a lot of the leadership is Asian, particularly Indian and South Asian. And this younger left elite is, supplanting the older elite. And this is reflected in the New York Times. And that's really what it is to say. It's not necessarily a class conflict between, which a lot of conservatives really love the class conflict. As I was talking about last week in my working class thing, conservatism thing, they imagine that they're on the side of the working class, that they're working class and blue collar. And for whatever reason, a lot of the conservatives who really stick to this narrative, who love this, this worldview or this theory of looking at contemporary conflicts in America, they really like this idea that it's a class war. But many of these people also come from the same class as the New York Times reporters that they're attacking. Aaron Sabarium, who wrote this article claiming it's a class war, he went to Yale University. And many of the other people who I know who are involved in Populist Inc. types or always talking about working class conservatism went to elite prep schools, went to elite universities. Their dad is like a partner at a corporate law firm. They're not working class at all. And it's very tough to find like the people who are always talking about working class conservatism and them actually just not even just coming from a working class background, but just a middle class background. None of them have that. I mean, Orrin Cass and Julius Krein, who are like as I talked about, two of the people I talked about last week, they both come from very elite backgrounds. I mean, Julius Krein went to an Ivy League school, worked in finance. Like, this guy's not working class, and no one would ever mistake them for being working class. But they prefer this class narrative because it makes, it adds status, moral virtue to, the people who are getting canceled, the old school liberals, when, to say that they're working class and they just care about objectivity. But it really, in fact, it's a conflict within our elites. And I've talked about this in previous podcasts. And that is what explains it. And the new elite is worse than the old elite, even though the old elite isn't very good either. And that's the best way of looking at this from the cancel culture perspective when it comes to New York Times. And I think if you want to, it's not a class analysis, it'd be tough to find the working class people. I mean, if you had to look at any people who come from humble backgrounds, I bet they are on the woke side, even though some of their people that they're standing aside with went to a prep school. Like the kids who canceled Don McNeil. So that's the thing to look at the New York Times cancel culture story. The other big cancel culture story comes from Disney and Star Wars. Gina Carano, who's a star on Disney Plus's The Mandalorian, got booted from the show over some of her boomer tweets. They were conservative tweets. She's a vocal conservative. She's been warned about her social media posts before, but the final tweet that did it in was this tweet, which, reading it on the surface, I thought this was like a liberal saying this, but it's actually conservative. And, is once again, of course, bringing up the Holocaust, because everything, anytime Americans bring up history, it's something to deal with World War II. And she was comparing Republicans, which I actually thought that it was comparing Democrats, like she was a liberal comparing Democrats to Jews, but instead she was comparing Republicans to Jews, and that this is like showing a demonization and dehumanizing of us, and that we're now having to worry about our neighbors. Which, if that tweet had been sent out a year ago, it would have clearly been normal, and all the liberals would have agreed with it. But now it's coming out now. They canceled Gina Carano over it. Carano's become a hero to many conservatives and Trump supporters because, well, she is a conservative and a Trump supporter. And I actually think this is one of the few times that they're actually defending somebody who's legitimately canceled. She did lose her job, and she's even had lost deals, and even the action figures that were done of her character in Star Wars, they're getting removed. She had her Star Wars spinoff that was supposed to heavily feature her. That's been canceled. So she is suffering the consequences for sharing her political beliefs. And a lot of times conservatives, they turn into heroes, people who are either full liberals who hate conservatives, such as James Gunn. James Gunn was a Marvel director who got canceled by Cernovich and Co. for all these weird pedophile jokes he kept making. And all these conservatives rushed to defend him because they love Guardians of the Galaxy. And sure enough, he got his job back, and conservatives big win against cancel culture. It's this is not against cancel culture. Carano is likely, really hurt her chances in Hollywood due to her conservative beliefs. And once again, Ben Shapiro, who is a big supporter of James Gunn, and a lot of other liberals who supposedly have been canceled by cancel culture, even though most of the time they just face criticism. They don't lose any job opportunities or anything like that. They just, they suffer some criticism on social media, and apparently that means they got canceled. And many conservatives also believe that same standard, because anytime a conservative gets a certain level of a certain kind of conservative, anytime they get ratioed, they claim that that's cancel culture. It's that is not cancel culture. But what happened to Gina Carano is, and she's now getting a deal with Daily Wire to start making movies. Daily Wire movies, interesting concept. I can't say I'm going to watch any of them, but interesting idea. And one of the funny things is that one of the tweets that got her in hot water was something that was vaguely anti-Semitic. I don't think she realized it's anti-Semitic. It was these people lifting up a Monopoly board or a chessboard of all these guys who are gathering around, and the cartoon, they all happen to be Jewish, and thus they use this as a reason. And they're like, this is anti-Semitic. I'm sure Carano didn't realize the intent behind it. She just thought it was like an anti-elite message. But if this had been anyone else that they had been canceled over, Ben Shapiro would definitely not be offering them a job. It's interesting that he's offering her a job, even despite that. So that is like, this is a legitimate case of cancel culture, and I actually, it's an important cultural phenomenon. It's like saying that Hollywood actors, if they have any conservative beliefs, and they're not allowed there. And there's been plenty of liberal stars who have tweeted insane things like calling for violence, calling for people to die, calling for Trump's assassination, and they've suffered zero consequences. And this woman just posts some goofy boomer stuff, and she loses her job over it. And a lot of these companies, there was an interview where a crisis PR person who works in Hollywood was saying that all these companies, they worry about what the left is saying on Twitter, and they try to appease them so much. They don't care about conservatives at all, so conservative boycotts don't matter to them. But a few leftists saying that they're going to boycott their product, or they're calling them racist, they'll end them. They'll do whatever they say. And you're seeing this with other people, with other factors too that are like legitimate cases of cancel culture, such as what's happening to Parler. Sleeping Giants is demanding that their host deplatform them. That anyone who's dealing business with Parler should be deplatformed and kicked off. And they may listen to that. I mean, Sleeping Giants has the power to do that, and so do all these other left-wing groups. And so that's legitimate cases of cancel culture. But oftentimes, like, conservatives abuse the term so badly that it becomes that they claim that Barry Weiss is a victim of cancel culture, even though, no, her star power and brand has been elevated due to these spurious claims of harassment and people bullying her. And she hasn't willingly lost a job. I mean, she resigned from the Times to do nothing. I think she has like a Substack where she makes plenty of money, probably more money than she made at the New York Times. And she has this huge brand that now she doesn't have to worry about the New York Times like saying she can't write something. She's not a victim of cancel culture, but that's what they say is a real martyr for this concept of free speech. And I always it's used to such an extent that it becomes nauseating. As somebody who would legitimately claim to be a victim of cancel culture, I mean, I was doxxed. I lost all my income over the dox at that time. I was not fired from the Daily Caller, though. I had already left from the Daily Caller, but I had to resign from a fellowship that was going to pay me, a significant amount of money to write another book. I had to lose that. I had lost other things, and over just my political beliefs, over things that I've written, But I've never really tried to claim, focus in on that or complain about cancel culture. It's like, I was canceled by cancel culture. Why is no one defending me? And there will always be people on Twitter. I'll see this, some, people who would be classified as far right. They'll always anytime that there's some story about cancel culture, then they'll say what about me? It's like, who cares? I mean, sometimes it's, there's an obsession that it becomes that we're permanent victims, but they'll ignore legitimate victims of this. Not necessarily in my case, but ordinary people who tweet something wrong or have a bad Facebook post and they lose their job. There was dozens of people during the George Floyd riots who lost their jobs over their tweets, over their social media posts, over the riots, either calling for calling for police to use firearms or use, stronger force. That would get people to lose their jobs and, of course, lose their reputation. And, conservatives didn't necessarily want to focus on that. They much prefer talking about celebrities who, are in a good position, whatever happens to them and whatever the woke mob does to them, they're generally in a good position afterwards, and they don't want to focus on the ordinary people that are legitimate victims of cancel culture. And yes, cancel culture is a real thing. All these liberals like to say that there's no such thing as cancel culture, and then they themselves become victims of cancel culture. There was this goober, Nathan J. Robinson, who is this big time leftist. He wears really goofy outfits. He's just a total dork. And he lost his job over criticizing Israel. He's now talking about cancel culture, even though he's had several tweets and I think even articles saying cancel culture isn't real. There's Will Wilkinson, who worked at the Niskanen Center. He's a goofball, libertarian, globalist, who had previously said cancel culture isn't real. And he lost his job over a joke he posted on Twitter. So now they even say this. And yeah, there is like a legitimate case that like cancel culture is real because, more and more people have like these private beliefs that are shared online or even in the company of their friends, and now they have to worry about losing their jobs, which has not been really the case before, or at least during the Cold War era. During the time of life for most boomers, they've never experienced this before, and this is a new America that we live in, where just about anybody can lose their jobs and positions over their political beliefs. I think the Nathan J. Robinson one is probably this is an actual political. I mean, he writes political opinions for a living, and he stressed a political opinion that a certain outlet, The Guardian, didn't like. I mean, that's happened many times before in the past, but people now legitimately believe in that. But the real problem with cancel culture is not that it's attacking celebrities and politicians or all these other people, many of whom are not getting canceled. And they're just getting ratioed on Twitter. It's what happens to ordinary Americans, that they realize that they can't speak freely on Facebook, on Twitter, and among their friends over the fear that they will lose their jobs and they'll have their reputations ruined. And that's the real cancel culture, not necessarily what happens to celebrities, even though Gina Carano is a much more deserving recipient of sympathy following her cancellation than many of the other people conservatives turn into martyrs after these stories. The final thing I want to talk about cancel culture is liberals appropriating this term to claim that people criticizing never Trump politicians is a sign of cancel culture. There was a recent example where a CNN host accused the North Carolina GOP chair of trying to cancel Senator Burr of North Carolina for voting to convict Trump in his impeachment trial. And they're like, you're trying to cancel him. And it's like, this is a powerful senator. This is a politician. And they're trying to say that any criticism of these politicians is cancel culture. It's like, no, that you could show disfavor for this politician. And they're using this in the case of Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, Ben Sass. They're trying to cancel them. And it's like, so apparently Republicans cannot show any disfavor for their politicians for doing something they don't like, which, that's how our political process works. If you don't like a politician, you vote them out. You could say you cancel them, but that's not necessarily cancel culture. It's not cancel culture to show disfavor and to criticize a politician for a decision he makes. That's normal part, or it should be a normal part of American politics. But for whatever reason, they say that this is unheard of for state parties to censure their senators for how they vote. It's like, no, it's pretty normal, and that's how the system works. If they do something that upsets their voters show disfavor for it. They're not voting for these people to vote however they believe. I mean, they can vote however they believe, but these people want them to vote a certain way. If they're not going to vote a certain way, they're going to try to remove them from office. That's a typical part of American politics. But they're trying to reappropriate cancel culture to apply to someone like Liz Cheney, and it ultimately is done because these people, it's such a bad faith argument, is that all these CNN hosts and all these people using it, they love the fact that they can cancel some ordinary Trump supporter who says something offensive on social media. They have no problem with that. But if like a powerful politician votes a wrong way that greatly upsets his supporters and their state party, apparently the state party cannot do anything about it. They cannot show their disfavor whatsoever if they want to avoid cancel culture. And it turns it into cancel culture into an asinine subject, which has no meaning. And the left has done this also with, Safe Space and Snowflake. They'll be like, oh, you're getting attacked, physically assaulted, and you're demanding to not being physically assaulted. Do you need a safe space? They used this argument when Rand Paul was following the Republican National Convention in D.C. and all these Antifa were harassing him and pushing him and his wife. And then him being like, I have a problem with this. And like, oh, do you need a safe space from being physically assaulted? It's like, yeah, you do. Because, this is a normal expectation in American life that you can walk freely throughout a city without a mob harassing you and your wife. It's, you should expect that. But so they reappropriate these concepts that come from the right and they make them completely idiotic and asinine, but then it becomes like the real definition. So cancel culture is when you criticize a politician that does something that the mainstream media likes. That's cancel culture, but it's not when the mainstream media gets some ordinary Trump supporter fired for their political views. That's not cancel culture. That's holding people accountable. That's consequence culture, as their term that they like to use is consequence culture. But there should be no consequences for them and their allies. So accountability culture, consequence culture, that's all stupid. And, so the concluding thought would be is cancel culture is real, but the focus should be on ordinary people, not necessarily people who work in the New York Times, Hollywood celebrities, or Republican politicians who get ratioed. It should be on ordinary Trump supporters and ordinary right-wing people who have to fear what they say, who have to fear over what they say in public, either through social media or even at a restaurant, may cost them their job. And there is a chilling effect on free speech due to this. So it is real, but I think conservatives allow the left to exploit it and reappropriate it to make it an asinine concept that no one should believe in. But if they focus on the legitimate cases of what's happening to ordinary Americans, it would be more solidified and a more worthy subject of constantly talking about. So that's the concluding thought on that. Now on to the Patreon question. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions on Highly Respected if you sign up for the Patreon option at Highly Respected's Patreon. This question comes from Dave. He asks, Scott, last week you criticized the minimum wage raise, but this week Mitt Romney and Tom Cotton have introduced a minimum wage raise that would ban illegal immigrants from using it, or taking advantage of it, rather. What do you think of this? So that's an interesting question that it comes up. And I noticed the bill. The first thing I want to say about Mitt Romney and Tom Cotton's bill is that it's not going to pass because barring illegal immigrants from its benefits, or barring illegal immigrants from getting hired, that's not going to happen. That means it's going to be dead on arrival. They're only going to pass a minimum wage increase if it, Democrats that is, if it benefits their people and they see that illegal immigrants are their people, so they're definitely not going to pass this. But it's still an interesting concept. I think the more interesting part of this is that, to answer that question, what do I think about it? I think it's pretty good. I mean, I think it still doesn't answer one of the problems with the minimum wage increase, that it hurts a lot of our people who are small businessmen out in rural areas where people are more able to live off of the minimum wage, but not necessarily those small business owners can afford to pay people minimum wage. That doesn't necessarily solve the problem, but if it came at the price of banning illegal employers from hiring illegal immigrants and creating stronger standards against that, I would probably be in favor of that bill. But it's not going to pass, so it's almost a moot point. The real interesting thing I want to point out is that Mitt Romney is clearly going for a populist messaging, and he is clearly building up himself to run in 2024. And if you look at all these bills he's passing, that he passed he introduced the bill to give everybody, all families, a substantial check if they have children. That's an interesting idea that a lot of other Republicans aren't going to do. He's also now doing this bill where raising the minimum wage that at the same time bans illegal immigrants from getting hired. That's showing, some daring, some innovation that a lot of Republicans haven't shown in the past. And you're probably going to see him introduce a lot more legislation. And you're also going to see him as one of the lead champions against amnesty when the amnesty battle occurs. So it's interesting that he is probably the strongest critic of Trump in the Senate. But at the same time, he's maneuvering to adopt a lot of these positions coming from these populist ink types who they pretended to like Trump when he was in office, but now they're wanting to get rid of Trump. And he's taking a lot of their ideas and making legislation to, bolster his status. And I think he is like a serious candidate in 2024. Yeah, Trump supporters really hate him, but he's banking on, a lot of these Trump supporters getting over Trump by the time of 2024. I don't necessarily think if that is the case. It could happen. I don't necessarily think it's going to happen. I think a lot of these people are going to retain their loyalty to him, and who Trump supports or opposes is going to matter in the 2024 election. But, things could change. And Romney is going to be would probably be a strong candidate in the next presidential election if he decides to run. And if you've looked at polling, his polling isn't horrible as you would imagine, and he still has high name recognition. And some of these people may forget that they hated him. There's been a lot of politicians that have overcome these difficulties. I think when Donald Trump first announced he would run, the majority of Republican voters didn't want him as their nominee. But as time went on, the majority of Republican voters did, and they accepted him. So maybe you could see something similar to happen with Mitt Romney. I mean, Mitt Romney is smartly positioning himself for a 2024 run. A lot of it depends on his health. I think he'll be 76, he'll be at least over 75 by the time he runs in 2024. But, I mean, looking at his health now, he's in great shape. If they showed him running through the halls of Congress, I mean, it shows he's still in pretty good shape. Certainly far better shape than Joe Biden and probably even Trump. So it's possible he can run. We'll have to see. And you're going to see him introduce a lot more interesting bills going forward because he's clearly positioning himself to be a leader in the Republican Party and to run in 2024. I think he will run barring any health circumstances. So that's the more important thing I think to realize. I think, to conclude, Bill's a good, interesting idea. It's not going to pass, but what's more interesting is that Mitt Romney thinks it's his ticket to winning the Republican nomination in 2024. So with that, that's all the time we have for Highly Respected this week. We'll, of course, be back next week, probably on Wednesday. And so look forward to that. May bring back a guest, may not, may just have me talking for over an hour again. We'll have to see. But until next time, stay respected.